We'd like to start our session today by honoring the land that we are on, which has been the site of human activity since time immemorial. It is the traditional territories of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements and is home to many Indigenous nations from across Turtle Island, including the Inuit and the Métis. These treaties and other agreements, including the One Dish with One Spoon, One Poop Well Covenant, are agreements to peacefully share the care of the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, newcomers in this generation or generations past. We are mindful of broken covenants, and we strive to make this right with the land, with each other. I would also like to acknowledge those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as the result of the transatlantic slave trade. And so I honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelica. I also invite all of us to not only acknowledge and act in ways that honor Indigenous connection to this land, but also to actively work to address the ways in which settler colonialism continues to impact Indigenous communities on a daily basis. For those of us who work to support newcomers to this land, I think that it includes learning more about and challenging the ways in which the newcomer serving sector, often called the settlement sector, is intertwined with ongoing settler colonialism. The persisting structures of settler colonialism are and always have been linked to inclusion and exclusion in Canada. Migrant labor has and continues to help further the settler colonial project of Canada through a precarious and non-status workforce of newcomers. And last year, members of TSLIP's Newcomer Services Collaboration Working Group and Employment Working Group had identified newcomer labor trafficking and exploitation as an increasingly urgent issue or issues of focus for our work plans. We also heard from our partners working in the sector that identifying and understanding labor trafficking and exploitation of newcomers and what rights and legal supports exist for newcomers who are experiencing this was of high priority and interest to them through a needs assessment that we had conducted. So our first webinar on this broad topic, as well as this gathering today, are timely, as they also align with the grassroots-led campaign for regularization that's underway to push the federal government to act broadly and meaningfully on increasing pathways to permanent residency. And so, we will also be having a Q&A session, like I mentioned, following the presentation, at which time you can add your questions to the chat, or you can use your hand raise function to ask your question directly. And my colleague, Tinbeat, will be supporting with that portion as well. And I think with that, I'd like to introduce Mary Gellatly. Mary is a community legal worker at Parkdale Community Legal Services. She works with workers and migrants to improve wages and working conditions and win status for all migrants. Thank you so much, Mary. The virtual floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being here today for this conversation. It's wonderful to get to know you and the work that you do and share the work that I've been involved in. So at Parkdale Legal, we provide legal services for migrants and people in precarious work. And we try and do it in a way that kind of links and brings together how immigration acts on people, as well as the labor laws in how we support people. That we also work with the Workers' Action Center, which is an organization of people in low wage and precarious work, largely racialized migrants, and the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change in partnership to further the rights of migrant workers. So I'll be talking a bit about the kind of work we do in kind of all these locations. And so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, that's great. And so, like you all, I see the exploitation that migrant workers are facing every day. And from my experience, it really is the result of kind of the colonial and racist immigration system that creates huge barriers to working class migrants from the global South. And we also have a labor law regime that doesn't work for workers, and in particular for migrants as well. And so, migrants are living and working in Canada on temporary work permits. They have, fewer rights and access to services and face greater exploitation at work. But migrants can and do fight back. There's a picture here of Luis Gabriel Flores, who encountered really horrendous conditions on the farm he was working with and fought back. And just a little bit of background. Luis was a migrant farm worker under the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. He came during COVID. He was working at what's called Scotland Farms. And there are 220 people in 6 bunkies, and this is in the context of COVID. And there's no protections in the bunkies, there's no protections in the fields where they were working. And so people started to get COVID, and Luis's bunkmate, Juan Lopez Chaparro, died from COVID. And so after that happened, Luis, spoke out at a meeting with the boss and wanted to improve health and safety protections for workers in their housing as well as in their workplaces. And the next day, the boss came to him and said he was fired, and that the following day he would be shipped back to Mexico, and that there was a plane for him. And Luis knew that he wasn't ready to go back. He needed to make money for his family, but he also wanted to, deal with do something about the conditions and the death of his friend. So he had met somebody at a church, and that person connected with Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, and through that, we were able to get him into a safe house off the farm. And TSLIP, my clinic, we were able to take on his legal case, and under the Health and Safety Act, Luis was successful in winning over $20,000 in damages because of reprisals against him for trying to enforce his rights. But he didn't stop there. He kept speaking out and put pressure on the Ministry of Labor to take action against Scotland Farms and the illness and deaths that taking place on the farm, and was successful in pushing them, with the support of many migrants, to get the Ministry of Labor to fine Scotland Farms $125,000 for their failure to take health and safety measures. So, my experience, workers do fight back, but the challenges they face, we have to provide supports so they can do that. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But, I think, Jesse said that people had been noticing more exploitation happening in workplaces, and that had been identified by the members of the group. And I think it's because what we're seeing is the shift in the immigration program from a permanent immigration program to much more of a two-step or immigration program where people come in on a temporary basis, and very few are actually permitted to stay. So this 2019, only 28% were permitted to get their PR status, and almost 1 million were working here on a temporary basis. So who are the what kind of conditions are people working under when they're working under temporary work permits? I'll just run through this quickly, and I'm happy to answer more questions. And people may be familiar with the conditions of work permits and the impacts they have on people. But just quickly, for the agricultural workers, which is actually quite a long program, it's over 50 or 60 years old. There is a agreement between Canada and Mexico and Caribbean countries to supply labor for our farms on contract for up to 10 months a year. And when people come, their work is tied to an employer, so they have to stay on the farm they have been hired into. Caregivers, very similar. They're on a tied work permit, which means they're only allowed to work for the employer that is on their work permit. And the employer has to get a labor market impact assessment to be able to hire the worker. Temp foreign workers, like low-skilled temp foreign workers, also are in situations in which the employer has to get a labor market impact assessment saying there's no Canadians available to do the job, and then they're able to hire people from outside the country. What do you think? Here's a question to you guys. What do you think that does when people's work permits are tied to one employer?
I can answer that, Mary.
Mhm.
So I think when you're tied to just one employer, the employer kind of knows that and can take advantage of you. Sometimes they could even make you work overtime and pay you less because they know you can't go anywhere. And if you do, that would have consequences. So I think that's where the exploitation really comes in, when the employers know that they have power over you, compared to when, like, if you are allowed to change employers and the employer would try to retain you and be on their best behavior. That's what I have seen happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's what we see every day. The tied work permits limit people's labor market mobility. The thing that the rest of us all kind of enjoy is, our one power in a workplace, which is very unbalanced in the power relation, is our ability to leave the job. And yet, the constraints of the program make it very difficult to leave, because then their immigration status is put into risk. And most folks have already paid fees to recruiters back home, and in money that often involves loans from people and families contributing to be able to get somebody over so they can work and send back money. So the debt burden makes it very difficult for people to speak out and put at risk their job, particularly in tied work permits. International students, I bet a whole bunch of you are working with international students. The number is growing. Canada's colleges are profiteering off of international students. There's way more now. I think the stat for 2019, the number of international students is much more. But just in terms of kind of this constraint put on folks is that they have to get when they get the study permit, they can get the work permit. They're allowed to work off campus. Traditionally, it's been up to a maximum of 20 hours a week. And that's where workers have run into problem. And I don't know if you remember, kind of a couple years ago, an international student was a trucker, got pulled over by the cops. Cops checked his logbook, saw he was working more than 20 hours. Called in CBSA, and he was deported because he was working more than the 20 hours. But you talk to international students and they have to work more than 20 hours a week because they're facing fees of close to $30,000 a year, which are really to get at. And so within Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, there's Migrant Students United, and they have been really pushing to change that cap on the number of hours worked. And some people probably know, just in November, there was an announcement that from November 15th to 2022 to December 31st, 2023, there was a pilot project allowing international students to work longer than over the cap. They can work more than 20 hours a week. If you're working with folks who are asking about this, one thing to make note of is that for people to be eligible for the pilot project with no cap, they have to have submitted their application for a study permit before October 7th, 2022. So if you have anybody who's come more recently and wants to apply, they will be held under the old rules of a 20-hour cap.
I just have a question, Mary, regarding the program, the uncapped program. How many students they intake in that pilot project? Like how many students they accepted?
So basically, they just, for all students that had study permits and work permits allowing them to work off campus, all of those existing students that had work permits prior to October 7th, they all have access to the no cap on their hours worked.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. And so, for the international students that we're probably all working with, many come and they come with the expectation and they come with a lot of misinformation that because they're studying here and they'll be able to get the postgraduate work permit, that they'll be able to regularize their employment or status and get it PR. But only 30% of international students get access to PR within 10 years. So we're really setting up a system to, get money for the universities, train a few people, and then get them out. The next one is the International Mobility Program. And so this will include people who are coming in from big companies doing inter-company employment transfers and all the post-graduate work permit. There's pressure on postgraduate work permit holders that are for folks that are trying to get PR, because it has to be kind of high skilled work. And we know, and you probably deal with this all the time, the racism that people face in the labor market, that many postgrads and, many students generally aren't able to get the kind of high skilled work they need on their postgraduate for their PR application. So that's a particular problem facing international refugee claimants. I'm sure you work with many refugee claimants. And as you know, refugee claimants, their work permit is only valid when the application's being processed and has not yet been denied. Once it is denied, the work permit is denied, is no longer in effect. So we know, people may appeal, but that takes time. And so refugees are often in and out of status and face difficulties when, the employers are asking for valid work permits and, when not, shifting to paying them cash, exploiting them more. And then, a big group of temporary residents is, of course, people without status, undocumented residents, people living here, many for many years, who don't have any work permits and face some of the most exploitive conditions. And, we can certainly share experiences of the kind of conditions that people face, but generally, undocumented workers are forced into sectors where they can be paid cash. So like construction, cleaning, food services, and, places where there's a huge degree of what we call a wage theft, but basically people not getting paid for their hours of work. And yeah, so there's about 500,000, and Josie talked about the regularization campaign that also with the Migrant Rights Network that we're pushing on the federal level for regularization of all undocumented workers. Okay. So, given kind of these structural kind of systems or programs which create conditions allowing employers to exploit workers, then what can workers do? And so I'm just going to run through a little bit on what the basic kind of legal rights are, at least on paper, for people with various immigration status. So that would basically include that kind of close to 1.7 million people that we just talked about with work permits or on and off work permits or have no work permits. And so basic for non-unionized workers, the basic labor law is the Employment Standards Act. It's supposed to provide the floor of rights that we as society deem is necessary for good, healthy workforce. So it includes things like minimum wage, hours of work, right to overtime, right for leaves, termination, that kind of thing. And I'm happy to do a basic workers' rights workshop at some point if people want to kind of get into some of the details of the Employment Standards Act. For migrant workers, the thing to know is that it applies to all workers. So whether you have a SIN number or a work permit or not, the Employment Standards Act applies to workers. And we'll talk about this a bit more, but the Ministry of Labor has a clear policy that they will not communicate any information from the claims or the people that are working with the federal government. So, and we've been testing it out over the years. We've not had any problems. We have no reason to believe that there is there. The one thing to note is that there are some exemptions in the Employment Standards Act for certain types of migrants. So migrant farm workers, well, agricultural workers. There's a lot of exemptions from the Employment Standards Act. It's supposed to be a floor, but like there's these big gaping holes that farm workers fall into, meaning that they don't necessarily get a minimum wage. There's not, necessarily a required minimum wage. It's a piece rate thing, but they can go below minimum wage. Hours of work, they don't have protection from working excessive hours. They don't have any overtime, premium pay, or limits on hours of work. That's one thing to watch out for. The excuse me, Employment Protection for Foreign Nationals Act also applies to migrants. And this came about because we were working particularly with a lot of care workers in like the late kind of 2000s who were facing fees from recruiters like of about $5,000 to get the support they needed to get into the live-in caregiver program in Canada. They could have done it themselves, but recruiters, take advantage of people. And then people were coming over and the recruiters were basically scamming people. People weren't getting their jobs. They were getting released at the airport, generally very difficult kinds of situations. In other cases, recruiters would take people's passports, their work permits, stick them in a basement in the house somewhere and force them to do other kinds of work. So with the lead of the Caregivers Action Center and folks, we pushed for changes, and one in 2009, the Employment Protection for Foreign Nationals Act, which means that it's prohibited or against the law for employers or recruiters to charge workers fees or any money for the cost of recruitment. They're not allowed to hold people's passports or work permits, or penalizing people for trying to assert their rights under it. And then the next kind of protection, in theory, that some migrants can gain access to is employment insurance, and that's the benefit we all pay into on a monthly basis. People can access it when they're out of a job, or sick, or pregnant, or parenting a newborn. And so this is run by the federal government. And so people to get EI need a valid SIN number and a valid work permit. Sorry, I have a cold. And it's throat lozenge in my mouth. But so the thing about employment insurance is a lot of folks who would qualify, who have been working, who do have a work permit, and then lose their job and the work permit's still valid, are afraid to go on EI because they think it will affect their PR application. So I think, it's important for us to be telling people they can access it if they meet the EI accessibility or requirements to get the benefit. The other thing that, if a worker is on a tied work permit and loses their job, if the work permit is still valid, they should be able to access EI for as long as the work permit is valid. Sorry, now I'm talking with a throat lozenge in my mouth. So, and workplace safety insurance, workers' compensation is supposed to be available for temporary workers. Where people run into problems is, say, construction workers who work for subcontractors and many subcontractors. The subcontractors don't pay into WSIB, so it's difficult to access it for some types of migrant workers in those kinds of situations. But when workers are injured on the job or become ill, they should be able to access WSIB, including when, for example, seasonal agricultural workers, when they go back home at the end of the contract, they can continue to get the benefits that they need. Okay, so what if a worker is undocumented? Undocumented workers, as I said, have the same legal rights to apply under the ESA for their, make a claim for any unpaid wages. The Ministry of Labor, won't report it. But in providing support for undocumented workers, the risk really is the employer. Because the employer is used to not being challenged. And there's a lot of scummy employers out there. They get really pissed off when workers, fight back, and they threaten to, and they do, call CBSA on the worker. There's really no risks to employers for reporting that they have employed people without work permits. So we have a general practice of in our work with undocumented people to do a real risk assessment, and this is something you can do with folks when you're talking to them about maybe pursuing their unpaid wages, is to ask if the employer has any information that would help CBSA locate them. So the address, if the employer knows where the person's new job site is, or knows where the kids go to school. Sometimes the employer will have people set up, including construction, cleaning, called an independent business number. So undocumented workers will set this up because they don't need a SIN number to do it. And then payment goes through the independent business number account. Any of those things can help CBSA find the folks and start doing what they do, which is usually, look at where they are in the process, start having meetings, possibly detain them, depending on the situation. So, at PCLS, we had an undocumented worker, and we were having a meeting at the Ministry of Labor in the investigation of the complaints. The employer was there, we were there, the ministry was there, and a CBSA officer showed up because the cop had phoned CBSA and told them where the worker would be at a specific time. So doing a risk assessment is very good to do. But given that there are risks, there's a lot of undocumented workers who are owed thousands and thousands and thousands of wages. And so we still want to be able to work with them to recoup some of those unpaid wages. And so I just worked with Rodriguez, who is a construction worker doing basement renos. He wasn't paid a couple $1,000 in unpaid wages. So the partnership with the Workers Action Center, we did two things. First, we checked out if the boss knew anything about his location. They didn't. So we decided to do a delegation visit where a number of us went directly to the employer's place of business with a demand letter demanding the wages be paid. That wasn't successful in that case. So we filed a Ministry of Labor claim, and that was successful. The employer paid, and so Rodriguez got his money. In David and Jasmine's case, they worked at the restaurant, again, worked for cash. The employer, again, didn't have any of their home information. Often communication is through WhatsApp or text or telephone between employers and employees in these kinds of job situations. So we did, because it was a restaurant and there was a public facing profile, we decided to do a delegation visit to the employer with a demand letter. Then we did a small leaflet and we posted details on social media. And that together forced the employer to pay up. So it really is, kind of two key things we do at TCLS and the Workers Action Center when it comes to undocumented workers. The first is the risk assessment of the employer, contacting CBSA. And then the second is an assessment of what strategies will work to force the employer to pay. So some employers get scared of the Ministry of Labor because they don't want them in their business. Other employers who have gone through the Ministry of Labor process before know that it's a very weak enforcement system. And basically, if the employer doesn't voluntarily pay, nothing will happen. So there's no consequence for not complying with orders to pay at the Ministry of Labor. No penalties, nothing. And so then, using other tactics where you do delegation visits and kind of get in the face of the employer is often, useful in those situations. So Jesse had asked me to talk about human trafficking, and I see Shadi's here from FCJ, which is great. And great if you want to join in. I am looking at human trafficking through the lens of what happens to the workers, because that's kind of my main concern is what happens to migrants in this process. And so just a little case study. So we talked to some workers and found out there was a group of workers who had paid $3,000 recruitment costs to come to Canada. Basically, the employer promised, the recruiter promised that they would be given housing, they would be given a job, they'd be given transport to the job, and that they would be given access to work permits, that they would get work permits. And so for this, people paid $3,000. When the workers got to Pearson International Airport, the recruiter says, well, look, if you want to get to the housing, you have to pay $300 in cash. And then they get to the house, and it's a 5-bedroom house in North York. There's 30 people in the house, and they have to pay $500 for a mattress in the house, wherever they could put it. And then work comes up, and 30 people have got to get to work, but there's only a 20-seater van. So people are shoved into the van and driven up to a farm in Bradford, picked up at 5 a.m., dropped back around 9 p.m. They're paid less than minimum wage and doing really heavy work, packing fruits and veggies all day. When workers ask about the work permits, where they are, and can they improve the conditions? The recruiters say that they will inform the cartel back home that the workers are causing problems, and then the cartel will take it out on their family. Whether this is true or not, who knows? People do say they were in a community where the cartel is very active. But the recruiter did not take the workers' passports or travel documents. So this is a situation. It went on for a couple months. And I'll talk a bit about what happened. But just before we do that, the government's approach to human trafficking is really one that is about finding and convicting what they call the traffickers, the people that are doing the business, making the money off of bringing people here under various false pretexts. So there's criminal code provision and there's provision in the Immigration Act, which prohibits trafficking and carries with it jail time. I got the stats for the criminal code investigation of criminal code cases on human trafficking. Only 30% of cases that make it to court result in conviction. I mean, that's higher than some other issues like rape and other kind of crimes, but so the majority do not result in the trafficking spending time. I couldn't get the same results from the immigration division, but so that's kind of the background framework for human trafficking regulation. So what happens to the workers though in this? And so basically, if the police have been informed about a situation, they get together with CBSA, the Canadian Border Security Agency, do some investigation, and if they believe that there's human trafficking, they'll raid the home where the workers are staying, or go to the workplace. A CBSA officer will be assigned to each migrant worker. The worker will must provide their identification. Workers will be interviewed to build evidence for the case against the recruiters and the traffickers. Police will give, can't see it under the, police will give people the option of immediately returning home or back to their home countries, or they'll be housed in a hotel for about 7 days. After that, they've got to find their own housing and shelter. If they have visitor status, which many people coming in often do have visitor status, the work without a permit may be noted on their file for future times that they try and come in. And then what's available for workers in precarious status who don't have access to a work permit is they can apply for a trafficking in persons temporary resident permit. It's valid for 6 months. And if approved, they may be able to apply for an open work permit so that it could work. The purpose of the permit, this TRP, is really to keep people who have been in this situation in the country while the investigation is going on, so it can get a conviction. So what happens to workers in this context when these kinds of things go on? Like in the example of the farm workers, they'll likely still have a large debt for the recruitment fees. Like Mexico's minimum wage is 8 hours a day. To try and get that money together, they probably have to take loans out, borrow money, or use up all their savings. They're now out of work, so they're not working, but they're on CBSA's radar, and they can't continue to support family back home, which most people do. they're not given any information or support to recover their unpaid wages in the legal recruitment. So to take their cases to Ministry of Labor to their wages paid. And then immigration status, because part of the reason to come up is both to work to support the family, but also to regularize their status in Canada. The options are quite limited. The application for TRP victim of trafficking are hard to get. And Shadi, you can speak about this, but I remember at the last Migrant Rights Network meeting, we heard from FCJ that there was real trouble getting the TRPs approved, and there's a lot of denial. We did an ATIP, and we did a request to get some information from the immigration. And only 200 TRP victims of trafficking permits have been approved in the past 5 years. So very few people get the TRPs and likely face pressures to return to their home country.
Yeah, it's been very difficult in our experience, because even though technically you don't have to have they say that you don't have to have a police investigation to apply for the TRP, and you can apply for it without having reported it to the police. In reality, what we see is that if there is no support letter from the police in the application and there's no ongoing police investigation in their case, they unfortunately get rejected. And also the other thing that we've seen is IRCC sometimes takes so many months to process their application. And that's another problem, is they're in limbo for such a long time without a work permit or without knowing whether they will be able to get access to supports or not for many months. And we never know how long they will take. So sometimes they take a little bit less time in cases where they know about a group and there's a very large group and they've already been given a heads up. But in other cases, especially cases where there's not an investigation, it can take months and months and months, which is obviously it puts the survivors in a very difficult situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when the survivors are usually waiting for their application to be processed, they're not allowed to work. How are they surviving during that time? Like, what are they doing?
I mean, people borrow from each other, try and get access to food banks and stuff. It depends how connected people are. So say if you're in the construction sector, people tend to meet people. So people might just try and get some jobs to get some money in and work without documentation. Yeah, I think people try to survive the best they can, and often in an environment where they don't really kind of know where to go to get support.
Thank you so much.
We also have some folks who've added some comments in the chat as well.
On this issue?
Yes.
Let me just quickly finish, and then we can just have a quick combo about what to do in these situations, or what kind of information we should be providing workers. So here's kind of, two different things that happen for workers in the farmer's case, the farm workers case. Two workers had phoned us. They were a couple, the woman's 6 months pregnant. And they didn't have any of the fears of, the threats around the cartel back in their country because of their particular situation. They felt stronger about leaving. So we got them out of the house before the raid took place, found them new housing. We helped them fill out legal aid and helped them find a lawyer, legal aid funding. And they've got a good basis of claim for a refugee claim. based on what happened in Mexico. And WAC, we will help them file their employment standards claim for unpaid wages. And then, but what happened for the rest of the folks? So there was about 3 houses, I think, maybe more, but one worker had already gone and reported it to the police. And so, you know, the homes were raided, 70 people were picked up, they were put in a hotel, which is, you know, very nice for a few days. And FCJ did a great job going up, meeting with workers, talking to them, and I presume helping, you know, with the TRP application. But you know, the future is very uncertain. And so I guess just you know, one of the things to one of the things to think about in people in this situation is the conditions are horrendous and super exploitative, but it's got to be the workers who decide you know, what their reality is and what they want to do in terms of, you know, either just leaving the situation and going and finding other undocumented work, or, you know, trying other strategies, or staying in the situation and pursuing with the police the human trafficking approach. You know, I think the government's really only concerned about catching the recruitment traffickers. I think we've got a program in which the businesses that use people in these situations and benefit from their labor have no consequences on them. There's no kind of remedy for workers in terms of kind of financial or any other kind of support in terms of what they've gone through. They bear the cost and the debt load of recruitment still. And, you know, the potential on regularizing of status is very low. So I think we have to provide that information very clearly to folks so that they can make the decisions of kind of what strategies they want to approach when they're in these really super exploitative kinds of conditions. But yes, yeah, so why don't we kind of open it up and have a chat about what people think about how to support people in these exploitative conditions and the programs that are available. Were there any questions in the chat on this?
No questions as of yet.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, we can also continue on. I was next going to turn to more generally with migrant workers. How do we help support them when they're being exploited at their work? How does that turn to that? And so, I mean, big thing, people need information about their rights at work. There's a lot of confusion. People will think because they don't have a work permit, they don't have any rights to basic standards, or if they get paid in cash, that's illegal, which it is not. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So where you can bring into your practice, providing people with at least links to information about the rights would be amazing. I've got just 3 sites here. One is the Workers Action Center provides fact sheets around basic employment standards in Chinese, Spanish, Tamil, Punjabi, Bengal, Somali, and English. Yep. And the Community Legal Education Center, or Education Ontario, CLEO, provides information in French and English. It's very plain language and fairly easy to understand. So people can always use Google Translate to navigate that one. And then the Ministry of Labor's website has a comprehensive guide on rights and how to enforce them. I think if you're working with somebody and they're in more precarious kinds of employment, encourage them to get as much information as they can about the employer. A lot of these kind of work sites, workers will only know the employer's telephone number and their first name. And so when we go to try and recover the unpaid wages, it's very difficult for us because we can't find the employer. And so, you know, just encourage workers to get as much information, the company name, address, phone numbers, license plates of employers' vehicles helps us track down employers when you know, there's not any other information available. And then the other piece is we have to kind of prove that they didn't get paid. So this is the problem with the enforcement system. Workers have to prove that the boss broke the law, not the other way around. And so we need evidence, and good evidence is that where workers document their hours of work and the pay they received, especially if they're paid in cash, which is totally legal, so that we can figure out how much money they're owed. That's basically access to information. I encourage you to check out websites. Jessie had asked about when do workers need support? So when would you think of referring people to, you know, get support on their unpaid wages? And I think really anytime anybody, you know, is being paid less than minimum wage, you know, has unpaid wages, overtime, not getting paid public holiday pay or not getting their vacation pay, you know, they're being penalized at work for asking about their rights. You know, they've been fired without notice, you know, they're being harassed or discriminated against at work, or their EI application has been denied. I think all of those are, you know, good reasons. Workers themselves generally know that they're being screwed over at work. They may not know that it's illegal and there's things to do about it, but workers have a good sense. And so, you know, it's identifying when people should get support. And then it's also kind of the reality of the enforcement system for labor violations. And Ministry of Labor, which enforces the Employment Standards Act, operates on a reactive model, not a proactive model. And so each individual, even if they have a group of workers, 6 workers, same boss, haven't been paid, each worker individually has to file their own claim. And you know, that makes it very difficult for many of the people that we work with, because the claim is in English, it's online, it's diddly to fill in, got very specific questions to ask. You can only do it in one sitting. You can't save it or else you lose it. So there's a lot of kind of barriers to people filling out the claim form on their own. And so, you know, when that happens, I mean, you guys can become proficient in filling out claim forms. I'm sure your jobs are already packed to the wazoo with the support that you provide. But what you can look at doing is referrals, and I'll talk a bit about how to refer to a clinic. So undocumented workers, I really think a good place to refer is to the Workers Action Center and Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, because there's a whole there's a committee of undocumented workers. So there's a place where people can come together and share their experiences of being undocumented, the strategies, how they survive, as well as that's linked to the regularization campaign to regularize people without status. But at WAC, we have monthly meetings in, say, for example, in Spanish, where Spanish workers come together. We talk about the work problems that they're having. We work individually to develop a strategy to get the information and the evidence required. And then we develop a strategy to go after the employer for the wages. This, of course, is done after everybody's done their immigration risk assessment. You can refer to the Workers' Action Center. The phone line is in, so for workers can phone in Spanish, Bengali, Tamil, English, Mandarin, and talk to people in the first language in those languages. Or, if the worker's having other challenges, you can phone and try and set up an appointment on the worker's behalf if they don't feel like they can phone. But the times of when the phone line is open is on the website. So the other one is community clinics. Most community clinics do employment law. There's some exceptions. And there's kind of two ways that people can try and navigate the clinic system, try and access services. One is through what we call specialty clinic, and that is where either the type of workplace problem is dealt with singly at that clinic, or the clinic works with a particular community. And so these are all fairly self-explanatory in terms of who they would serve. The Industrial Accident Victims Group of Ontario and Injured Workers would help people, particularly with workplace injuries. And particularly, they're both really have a lot of experience working with migrants and undocumented migrants who are facing workplace injuries and trying to get their workers' comp home. So it'll be a kind of safe space for people to refer there. And then the others are community-specific. Health and Safety Legal Clinic also does health and safety problems, reprisals, and they do workers' comp as well. So those are some clinics you can refer to if you're trying to get service in the first language for people. There are the 13 community clinics. I'm just talking GTA. The group here is largely GTA. There's community clinics and there's student legal aid services. Community clinics are basically, they usually have a geography. There's kind of three things you need to, hoops you need to jump over, unfortunately, like many community agencies. So first hoop is financial. Under Ford, this has stayed ridiculously low, but a single person, in theory, shouldn't have an income of over 22,000. So it excludes people who are full-time minimum wage earners. So if you're talking to somebody and trying to refer to a community clinic and they've lost their job, you might remind them that their income is zero because they're unemployed. And, just try and get through the financial criteria. The next piece is you've got to double check the website to make sure they provide the services. Like I think Jane Finch Community Clinic does not do employment law. So where community clinics like Jane Finch don't provide employment law, you can give us a call at PCLS. Parkdale Legal Services, we tend to have a bit of a broader scope of service around employment. And then the other thing, the person. All right. So I would always, if you're referring to a legal clinic, they're all different types. The one thing I would advise is, really work with the person to negotiate it. I think COVID did a number, like on all our agencies and clinics as well. So when I just did a quick look at even what the process was to contact a legal clinic on the website. Each one is different. It's a tad confusing. So I think you should do a warm referral, talk to a real person if you can, and get somebody an appointment. If not, help guide people through. Once they get into the clinic, clinics use interpretation services, so people will be supported to communicate with their language, reduce the barrier. So that's not covered. And that was it for my little answering the questions that Jesse gave me. Feel free to contact me at TCLS if you have questions or want to know what to do or where to refer.
Thank you so much, Mary, for such a wonderful workshop. It really gave us a lot of information around what labor exploitation looks like and the legal options that folks have that are facing this exploitation. So as you mentioned, we'd like to open it up for questions. We did have one question come in as you were speaking. And the question reads, does this organization assist York Region clients as well? So it come in a bit earlier, so it could be referring to a Workers Action Center or Parkdale Legal Clinic. So I'll let you answer.
Yeah, so if you're in North York and you have kind of workplace issues, the Jane Finch Clinic doesn't, I just said that, doesn't do workers' rights. So there, you could refer either to the Workers Action Center, which serves folks from all around the GTA, or Parkdale Legal. We could also take a look at it, at least see if it might be a possible thing that we could take. And I would say, yeah, if it's an undocumented worker who wants to connect with other undocumented workers, the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, works with people all across Ontario, really.
Thank you, Mary, for answering that question. We also had another question, more of a general question. If the presentation, we had shared that the recording itself will be shared, but will the slide deck be available to be shared as well? Some folks were wondering.
Yeah, sure, I could. Yeah, I'll send it to
Jesse.
To Jesse, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. And yeah, as we mentioned, you can use the raise your hand function or put your questions in the chat. Thanks, folks.
I have a question. So in the presentation, you mentioned that most of the people or undocumented workers that comes, it's usually from cartel area, and the recruiters send them over here. Are they usually sent by the recruiters like through illegal means? So that means they have no status at all in Canada?
Yeah, so in that particular story, it was more about the recruiters, and the recruiters using, I think, more tactics to scare people by raising the cartel. The cartel was not involved in the recruitment of the workers to work on the farm. I think that was a scare tactic by the employer, basically. And I mean, kind of what drives people coming here with precarious status? There are push and pull factors. So we've got Canada that needs a lot of labor. So we've got the government that opens up programs not to bring people in to work on a permanent basis, but to work on a temporary basis with fewer rights and standards. And so that is happening. And some people fall out of status through that process. Recruiters are also responding to some of the push factors where conditions are so bad in home countries that recruiting people to fill the labor needs in Canada kind of gets pushed as well.
So the recruiters are usually based in Canada, and they're trying to bring in workers from
Yes.
countries where the conditions are not very livable, or the employment, the pay rate is very low. So they try to bring people in on like a temporary permit, and then people when come here after if they're done their contract, if they don't want to go back, they try to look at other sources, but usually they become undocumented because their temporary visa expires, right? Is that?
Yeah, there's, yeah, exactly. The recruiters are here, they're filling labor needs here. People variously, keep renewing their temp foreign worker permit, or, the visitor permit, or, may apply for a refugee claim, which puts them in the whole refugee process, claims process. May work undocumented to establish themselves in the country so that they can apply through H&C, humanitarian compassionate ground, PR application. So there's a whole variety of things that happen.
One last question, and then that would be it from my side. Sorry if I'm asking too many. There was a program mentioned for the trafficking people for 6 months, but it was also said in presentation that most of the application get rejected. But if the persons are genuinely trafficked, what are some of the reasons their applications are being rejected or denied? Like, what's the main reasons the applications are being denied? That's my question for the program specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think Shadi, who has experience with them, pointed out to one where it may be a situation of super exploitative conditions that looks like trafficking, but because it wasn't officially investigated as a criminal matter, then it wasn't considered, the TRP was refused. From the immigration side, they have very specific kind of things they look at, like were the passports and work permits, were they taken away to reduce people's mobility from leaving, or were they constrained from going out of the house? Those kinds of things. So they do have particular things they're looking for, which may not have happened in the particular case, which then leads to denials of the TRP.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you for answering all the questions.
I see Jesse has his hand up, and then we have one question in the chat as well.
Thanks. Actually, I'm going to be echoing the question from the chat as well. That was also my question. So basically, you had mentioned that there are not many repercussions for employers around unpaid wages. Like there's no teeth with the ministry, and the onus is on the worker to kind of prove the case. And I can see how adding more enforcement against employers could, essentially end up hurting undocumented workers further as well. But I'm wondering if there have been efforts made who are efforts made or that are currently underway to make changes to this, and if there are ways to kind of hold employers and recruiters accountable that are exploiting newcomers.
Yeah, so one of the things, and I didn't get into it, but we had been pushing for years to improve enforcement of recruiters and to make employers that use recruiters liable to the fees that get paid. So even under Ford, it's wild. Ford did just pass a law in November, which will require recruiters to be licensed to practice in Ontario. And employers will have to use a licensed recruiter or face a fine for, not using a licensed recruiter. And then there's all these rules that recruiters would have to follow, like they can't charge illegal fees, they can't see documents, they can't, do a number of things. So, this would, when it comes into force, and unfortunately, I was just talking to the ministry recently and they said, oh, it'll come into force in 2024. It's like, I guess that's a big priority, right? And so that will be one tool to hopefully, put some of the accountability on the employers, the ones that are really benefiting from these schemes and these kind of exploitation of workers. in the past, we've run campaigns to improve enforcement, to get more money into enforcement, to get more proactive enforcement, where they go out and inspect workplaces. As part of our Justice for Workers campaign, we're looking at kind of bumping that up again, because so many workers are filing claims and not getting the wages paid. So for instance, if an employer doesn't voluntarily pay, it goes to the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Finance only has a 19% success rate in getting money from employers. I mean, I bet you if we got stats on Ministry of Finance getting money out of us, it would be a much different stat. But
Thank you for answering that. We have another question in the chat, and it reads, once you file a Ministry of Labor claim, how long do investigations take on average?
yeah, so it changes depending on backlog and depending on COVID. But since COVID, it's gotten a little bit better. And what'll basically happen if you help somebody file a claim, that they'll get a file number right away, and kind of within a month, they'll get a call from the Ministry of Labor to get more information about their claim, to get any documents or evidence for the claim. And then they'll try and settle it. I say to the employer, there's a claim against you, will you pay? If the employer says no, then it goes to a full investigation. So it could settle in the first instance if the employer just wants to pay or decides to pay what they should have paid in the first place. And so that could be like a couple months, 2 months maybe. And then if the employer kind of fights it, it's probably going to be about 6 months. Anything else?
We just had another one come in. Do these companies get flagged if they keep getting claims against them?
So yes, in theory, the Ministry of Labor will keep on file an employer where the employer has been ordered to pay a worker unpaid wages. And they have a penalty system in which if somebody's a repeat offenders, it's the discretion of the Employment Standards Officer to give a fine for repeat offense. I did a Freedom of Information request to look at how many fines have been given out since Ford came into power. And I think there was like maybe 200 fines. And they're about $350 each, so not much money. And there's usually about an average of 15,000 claims filed each year, and 70% of those are confirmed as employer violations. So in theory, if we had a much more aggressive enforcement, there's some tools there that could be used. They're just not being used.
The next question reads, how effective is the new anti-human trafficking investigation unit that the Ministry of Labor put together 6 months ago?
Yeah, I guess it's like, from whose perspective, right? You know, like I don't know the kind of conviction rates in the last 6 months of the provincial government's whatever new program. But we do know that immigration hasn't put in new things to support, either on a provincial basis, supporting people to file employment standards claims for violations of their rights, or on a federal level, you know, pathways to PR for people who have been through this experience. And so I think still the net, some of the key difficulties with the program still is that it's more about getting the recruiters and not supporting the workers. Like a lot of these big cases where they have got convictions, there'll be fines So there was a group in Barrie, I think FCJ helped with this one too, where there's a lot of Guatemalan workers working hospitality, really crappy conditions. And they find the recruiter like $300,000, but none of that money goes to the workers, who probably have been paid crappy wages. Most of them have been sent home already anyways. And those fines go into provincial coffers. I mean, I think, what we need to continue pushing for is like the regularization campaign that Stephen mentioned in the beginning, and, opening up, our immigration and providing status to working people, working class people, who provide, the essential services that we saw during COVID and heralded, but, allow those people to stay on a permanent basis.
It doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in right now.
Okay,
I'll
I
flip
think-
you my slide deck. Thank you.
that would be amazing. Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you everyone for attending, for your questions, and for those of you who also contributed additional information throughout the session. Thank you again, Mary, for being here and sharing your work and knowledge with us, particularly as you're dealing with the cold. So we really appreciate that. It's hard to talk for almost an hour when you're dealing with that. So thank you so much. And a huge thank you also to the members of the TSLIP's Newcomer Service Collaboration Working Group, as well as the employment working groups in helping organize the session.